Um, uh, Rituparna, Deepa, I mean, you two are, and Ramen, of course. Fascinating just listening to you all. It's inspiring. So, I mean, lovely to have you all here. Anandita, thank you so much for bringing us all together like this again. Okay, so yes, so as a publisher, you see, most of the things about storytelling have obviously already got covered in a very, very nice and comprehensive, cohesive sort of manner. Publishing, when we are talking about storytelling from a publisher's point of view, it's obviously no different because the elements of storytelling remain the same. The elements of the story, the essence of everything remains the same. It's just that now we are looking at it from a commercial point of view, and instead of an oral storytelling where or corporate storytelling where the story is going out to a much larger sort of set of audience. Here, the moment we talk of publishing, we are sort of now getting it back into the realm of that little palm that you have, because that's what books are, right? Books get between your palms, and you just have those two pairs of eyes or one pair of eyes that's going over the books. So I'll be talking about that, but very quickly, let me tell you. See, whatever I'll be talking about today is largely in the context of what I deal with. So I deal with what a format of books called picture books, and picture books are very different from, say, a novel or a chapter book for children. So I mean, just to give you an example, this is what a picture book would look like, where uh, these are larger sort of format books with a lot of illustration. So that you'll have full covered colored pictures covering both sides of the page, and you'll have text, very minimal text. So typically a picture book caters to children readers under the age of, say, 6 years or 5 years. So the texts are larger, bolder, fewer words. So words would typically be in the range of, say, 400 words or 500 words. So those are those little things that we have to keep in mind when we are listening to me right now. I mean, my sharing about storytelling. um, Also, we have to keep in mind that in a picture book, there is a very, very complex interplay happening between the visuals and the words. At times, it's a very literal sort of translation of, so the visuals become a very literal sort of translation of the words itself. But at other times, there's a sort of parallel visual narrative that's going on. So the text may be saying something like, "Oh, the child was very bored," but the illustration could say something very, very different. The illustration could show the child hanging upside down from the window or from the tree. I mean, enjoying herself and all that. So you could also have a very contrast sort of a visual narrative going on. Therefore, the storytelling becomes a very complex sort of an art form there in a picture book. Also, remember, when we are talking of a picture book, we are typically, as I said, mentioned, we are dealing with very young children. And young children, therefore, they could be reading. I mean, they'll obviously not be reading on their own. I mean, the words will have to be read out to them by an adult. That makes it again very, very challenging, because here is a book which is actually being consumed by both the adult and the child. So therefore, the communication has to be in such a way, the storytelling has to be in such a way that it's appealing to, or maybe at even the grandparents at times. So it has to appeal to all age groups, and that is where that's what's it brings about the challenge, but it's also the most rewarding bit about a picture book. So having established that, uh, going back to the main element, I mean, why do we tell stories? We tell stories, as Rituparna said, as Deepa said, as Ramin said. We need to connect. The main purpose of telling stories is to make connections. And I'll give you a very small little story. It's a personal sort of thing that happened between my daughter and I. My daughter was very young at that time. She would have been about 4 years old. And in my family, like, I've always read out to my children from a very, very young age. And I've seen Rituparna do that with her son as well. So I mean, I know, and Deepa does it. So I know that culture. We know how strong that bond happens between a parent and a child when books are read aloud to them from a very young age. So I remember, and this was a book by Oliver Jeffers. It's called The Heart in a Bottle. It's a very poignant sort of tale where it's talking about death of a parent. I mean, we're not even sure whether it's a father, it's a grandfather, or say just a it's a father figure for the little girl. And it's a beautiful story, and my daughter and I were reading it, and whenever I read that story out, even now I sort of choke. There are places where I end up choking. So there's a point where the two of them are, so in the story, the girl and the father figure, they are exploring a lot of things together. They go out into the wild and to the beach, and they're exploring, they're learning so many things. And suddenly there comes a day when the girl finds that little sofa where they would always sit and read together. That sofa is empty, that chair is empty. And that's the point where the text says that, okay, now so they were sharing till the day the girl discovers that the just discovers an empty chair. And it doesn't say, so in terms of words, it doesn't say whether the father has died or whether he's gone, left them, etc. It just leaves it ambiguous in that sense. My daughter, who was, as I said, she was 4 at that time, she read it, and this was the first time we were reading it. And I paused, because for me, I mean, I was choking at that. I was really in tears at that stage. So she looked at me and she said, "Do you think the father's died?" I said, "What do you think?" She says, "Yeah, looks like the father has died." And then I looked at her. So I paused. I had to pause for a while because I had to contain myself. And after a while, I asked her, if suppose I were to die, okay, do you think you would continue reading books the way we do now, or we've been doing all this while? And so she stopped. She looked at me and she stopped. And then she said, okay, I know what you mean. You're saying you're not going to die right away, but it's just a supposing thing, right? I said, yes, it's just a supposing thing. And she said, yes, I would continue reading the way we are reading now, because that is what will always remind me of you. Okay. And then she suddenly stopped and she said, would you do it if I were to die? And I said, yes, I would continue reading books alone to myself if you were to die, because, that would sort of keep you alive for me. Now, why I'm saying this is because, that's the essence of storytelling in a book form. That's what it does. You have all your emotions encapsulated between the two covers, be it 30 pages, 28 pages, but there is so much depth that happens. And because that the story is out there for you to see, you can dwell upon it, you can go back to it, you can turn the pages, and you can relive that story, retell that story in your mind ad nauseum. I mean, so many times you can go back to it, that it leaves that lasting impression on the child's mind.
Absolutely.
And that is what's so special about the book, because it helps you
ఏది
make that
ఎక్కడికి వెళ్ళింది?
connection between the adult who's reading it and the child who's reading it. And of course, the other elements remain constant. I mean, what are the main elements of storytelling? You'll have characters, you'll have the plot, there'll be a conflict, there'll be a resolution, there'll be the growth of that character, how the character is evolving through the course of the
Slowly.
the trajectory of the story, whether the character is growing, whether the character is stagnant, and all that. So everything is happening between those 32 pages, and it's a very complex sort of storytelling, therefore, because you've got to tell a complete story in a very, very short span of space and time. Main essence, Anandita, would have to be that's across true for any kind of stories. You've got to keep it simple. The moment we make our stories complex is the moment we lose our audience, we lose our readers, we lose those pair of eyes, ears. They just run away, right? So we've got to keep it simple, in thought, thematically, in the language that we are using. I mean, the moment we start using complicated language, we lose, because the thought becomes so complex in itself that the essence of the story disappears. What else? It has to have that emotional appeal. Even a slapstick story. I mean, even the, I mean, I always equate for the child, when I'm talking to children, I always tell them, think of stories the same way you would think of movies, or you would think of your cartoon shows that are happening, because essentially everything is storytelling. And even if it's a very, very funny slapstick sort of a book or TV show or whatever, you've got to have those elements of emotional connect that the child has to feel with the character, because if that doesn't happen, your storytelling is falling flat. Okay, so even in those moments, you've got to,
Absolutely.
there's something that's got to touch your soul somewhere. And unless that happens, your story doesn't have that appeal.
All the
Uh,
effort goes away. All the
and the
effort
effort
goes.
goes away, right? And as Rituparna had mentioned, I think Deepa also mentioned that your stories have to be honest. Unless there is honesty, unless there is that element of truthfulness in that stories. I mean, when I'm saying we're talking about fiction, right? They don't have to be true stories, but there has to be an element of honesty, authenticity, truthfulness. I mean, when a child is listening to a story or when a child is reading that story, they need to feel that yes, there are elements that are some way, it's believable, it's possible. Even if it's a fantasy tale, it has to be believable for the child. I think pretty much. I mean, as I said, it's pretty much the same thing that applies to oral storytelling. And I'm
I
sure
think
Rituparna.
anyone who publishes book for stories and write for children, I think they are very beautiful people. I don't know whether the vision is
You
there.
know what? And Ramin, see, and in fact, Ramin that way has that wonderful balance between being that corporate, but even Deepa and Rituparna.
Ritu, Ritu, yes.
You always keep interacting with the adults, with the corporate world, and come back to that space of the children's stories. It's a wonderful space to be in. I'm sure everybody would vouch for that.
I remember my first picture book was a visit to the zoo, and it had a lot of
Yes.
animals and those pop-ups and all that. And for some reason, I don't know, the giraffe got beheaded, and I cried a lot. And I preserved that book for a long time, and I think that is the time from where I developed my love for animals. So this is
Yes.
how it's a manifestation of certain things you experience in your
Yes.
childhood. Now
Yes.
tell me, now of course we have to balance between reality also. Okay, when you're doing
Yeah.
a business, a publishing job, so
Oh,
are there do you so
don't
do
touch
you
those
do
raw
that was raw, but yeah, that's reality. So do you have some demanding style and all, because after all your return of investment should be there.
Yeah.
So how viable is it in terms of business, revenue or profit, whatever you say, in terms of business, when you get a demand, नहीं नहीं ये सब आजकल बिक नहीं रहा है, children are more towards high tech things, how do you deal with it?
So yeah, it is always tricky, Anandita, because business, and especially if we are dealing with picture books for children in India, it's I feel it's the most difficult form of publishing to get into because a lot of factors. I mean, I don't want to get into the details of that, but it's very, very difficult. I mean, it is by far the most challenging of all forms of publishing in India today. So therefore, to the extent that therefore even the much bigger, larger publishers are also not. They don't want to take that risk on picture books beyond the point. So even a large publishing house, a conglomerate would probably end up doing say 2 picture books, 3 picture books a year, compared to the hundreds of other forms of books that they do. So it is difficult. If a publishing house were to just sort of survive on picture books, it's difficult, right? So let me not get there at all.
Okay, okay, I understand.
We'll talk about this
But
the
of course, I mean, of course, I think
yeah, we'll talk
this
about the other part of it, how to focus on
right.
so therefore those demands are always there. uh, that's where an independent sort of smaller publisher maybe I feel has an advantage over the larger publishing houses, because the larger publishing houses, they have to balance a lot of things. They have higher costs, higher overheads, so a lot of things that they have to. For a smaller publishing house, it's easier. I mean, if a book doesn't do well, and well again is a very relative sort of term, it's okay, because you know that in any case you have a very limited readership base. And the best part of that is, Anandita, that after a while you start knowing the nerves of the pulse of your readers, because it's a smaller base. You know exactly what your reader would connect with. And therefore you're more willing to take risks. So that uh, it's I would say it's therefore it ends up being more rewarding, being a smaller
Very
publisher. You will still have to take care of the saleability aspect of it, but I still feel that selling books as a smaller publisher is, I mean, if you're marketing program and
Right.
promotion, etc., is in place,
Right.
you wouldn't have a problem there. You would, of
Good.
course. The one thing that we will have to take care of is who is my books directly going to. So if I have a larger, if my target is, say, school libraries, then of course my publishing plan will have more of, say, non-fiction sort of
Yeah,
school
of course.
stories, because I know that's what librarians are looking for. But if I know that my books are going directly, if my books are being bought directly by parents of very young children, I will try and incorporate the kind of stories that I feel the parent and the child will bond over, right? So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Great, great. I mean, I fully, but at least nice to know it's quite encouraging. It's not that all that discouraging. So
it's
coming,
not. It's
yeah,
finally how well you get your
right,
promotion
right.
aspect right. Yeah,
How you develop your business case.
yeah.
So coming from taking a cue from your response, how storytelling can be a career as a communicator, be it an author or a publisher. How would you recommend?
So no, as an author, forget about it being a career. I mean, it's got to be a side, and especially again, I'm talking in terms of children's books, oblique picture books. It
Yes.
cannot be your mainstay. You can make it an extra something to it. If you want, I mean, if you're in it for earning, your money out of it. Children's books is not. Being an author is not something that's going to get you there. Being a publisher, again, as I told you, I mean, the tricks are, the challenges are always there. But there are a lot of associated sort of services that go into publishing a book, and that's where editors come in, illustrators come in. You have your graphic designers, you have your art directors, and all these form a part of that storytelling landscape. For publishing for children's books. So even if as an author you can't make a living out of it, you definitely can make a living out of being an editor or an illustrator or a graphic designer, either as a freelancer or you become a part of a larger organization. So it's possible. It's not that bleak. As an author, Ramen, I mean, you'll have to tell me.
Yeah, yeah, we know people who has taken VR and writing stories for children.
Yeah.
Enough money to feed my pet Labrador for a week also.
Yeah, exactly. So no, I would not, I mean, don't make it a career. But then but if you end up, I mean, if you end up becoming a Ruskin Bond, believe me, there cannot be a more satisfying career in life.
Yes,
There
because the
cannot.
passion is there.
It's,
Because
yes,
the passion is there. So
absolutely.
you, since you publisher for young people's book, I mean children books. Do you think this form of storytelling, mainly when you're coming, I'm talking to you in from the context of a publisher for young children picture books.
Yeah.
Do you think it impacts the adult mind also? Do they benefit from it?
I think so. I think so. I mean, that example I gave you between my daughter, the conversation that was happening between my daughter and me, giving that book. Now, just look at the kind of elements that were going into it. Uh, it was starting a communication between my daughter and I on a very, very difficult sort of subject. Now, under normal circumstances, it's quite possible that I may not have, as a parent, I may have found it very difficult to talk about death with my child, a 4-year-old. But given the moment it's in the form of a book, and I'm privy to that storytelling, that both she and I are together privy to it, right? That narrative, suddenly it becomes that much easier for me. Okay, so it becomes like it becomes like a conversation starter. It becomes like suddenly it opens up a means for me to bring in so many of my maybe personal experiences. So the moment that difficult topic comes up, for instance, I could, and the moment that conversation begins between an adult and a child, there could be so many other points of references that the adult could bring into that story, that space, that conversational space that's happening between the adult and the child. That's one. The second is, it, as Ritu Parna and Deepa also mentioned, the imaginative aspect of, I mean, how storytelling opens up that huge imaginative space for the listener, for anyone who's at the receiving end of that storytelling. The same is true for the adult as well. Because as Deepa was saying, I think we lose our imagination as we grow older. Teachers, Rituparna was mentioning how difficult it is to get the teachers
Yes.
into a space where they start imagining, reimagining again, you know. So that's what storytelling, and that's what picture books does to adults. It helps you express better. It helps you communicate that much better, either in your own sphere, either with your child, in the family, within the family. So all these are those pluses that are happening. And you know, I think the most important thing is that it reinforces to the adult that stories are all around you, because when you realize that finally all that's going into a story book, a picture book, these are elements that have been taken from real life at some point. I mean, these are all inspirations that happen, come to us, come to authors from their daily lives. It's inspiration is all around us, right? And when you see them getting encapsulated in a book form, that's when sort of reinforces that our lives are lovely stories that are unfolding before us daily, on a daily basis, and that we are party, you know, we are a part of that story, our own personal stories and storytelling. I think that makes it a very powerful and enriching sort of growth space individually for that
Right,
adult, I
right.
feel. Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, I feel once you read a children's book, you become a child. You know, the child inside comes out, and you get rejuvenated. You feel very
Absolutely.
light, and it's a different experience altogether. And tugging below the blanket with your child and reading out a comic, especially Tintin, which I still read.
We still, yes,
Whenever I get to know.
Tintin and Asterix are absolute favorites
Absolutely,
across all
absolutely,
age group.
absolutely.
Yes,
So there cannot be better stress busters. So with
yes.
this, thank you so much, and I'll come to the questions quickly. Jacob, any questions for Richa, please?
Yeah, we have one question from Ravindran.
Yeah.
All are all picture books of 32 pages, and how it is different
Uh,
from illustrated books?
Okay, so Ravindran, to very quickly, I'll take on both. So for a picture book, no, they don't have to be 32, but the global standard is sort of 32 pages. It could be, you know, see, picture books are bound in a certain manner. So they are done in multiples of 8. Therefore, the slimmest book that you will have, picture book that you'll have, will probably be 16 pages. Then going on to 24, and then 32, and then 40, and then 48, and so on. 32 tends to be the global sort of average, industry average, I would say, globally. That's one. And how are they different from illustrated? You see, you know, the illustrated storybooks end up being just the illustrations end up being visual paraphrasing of the text that's gone into it. So what an illustrated book will do is, suppose there's a story, like all of us know, for instance, Champak, right? So when we are reading a Champak, or when we are reading a story in, say, Tinkle, what the illustrator is doing is taking up any one element of that story from that entire page or 2 pages and illustrating that one little bit. Okay, so it becomes an illustrated story, illustrated storybook. What a picture book is doing, as I had initially shared, was that, you know, it's a very, very complicated sort of interplay that's happening. So there may the words are very few. There are so many extras that can go into the visual, because we are using that double spread. We are using both the pages visually to tell that visual narrative. So there is scope for a whole host of extra things to be put in there. It's quite possible that my text will not mention, say, a grandmother at all in the text, in the words. So maybe it's a story of a family, okay, where the text is only mentioning, say, the maybe a mother and the dog and the child, okay. So the story is actually about the words are only talking about these three characters, but visually we are also showing a grandmother figure in the background all the time, and she's doing something across the pages, okay. We are adding another layer to our story, which is not possible in an illustrated, because we don't have the scope for that. You know, we are just taking on one paraphrase sort of element of the text, and that's what. And as I had shared initially, the visual could be sharing an exact opposite of what the text is saying. So the text could be saying that the girl is very sad, but the visual could be showing that she's having a ball of a time. So, you know, it's
Right.
more complicated that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ma'am,
Any other questions?
we have last question from Sri Devi. Can you explain what are the steps in publishing illustrated storybook after writing a story?
So if you have once you have your story ready with you, that's when you approach the publisher. The first thing you have to develop if you want to go into publishing is a lot of patience. I mean, tremendous patience. And when I say patience, it could, one story could take, I don't want to discourage you, but it could take anything between 6 months to 6 years for getting accepted by a publisher. So you've got to develop that patience, and you've got to develop that thick skin, because each time you approach a publisher, it's quite possible that they may never get back to you on your query, on your manuscript submission. B, they may just write a very polite email saying sorry, it does not fit our plan, etc., etc. Therefore, the trick is not to take it personally, because remember that a publishing house, it's possible that even if they love the story, they are not able to take it simply because they may have done a similar story, or at that point in time for the next 2 years, maybe they want to focus only on non-fiction when you have sent in a fiction, and so on. I mean, there can be so many aspects to why
Correct.
your story may not get selected. So don't take it personally. Share it with publishers, of course, and don't share it with just one publisher at one time. Share it with 5 at the same time, because it's an accepted practice that when you're sharing, you will not be wasting that amount of time just sharing it with one publisher. Lucky day when you do hear from the publisher or the editor saying, yes, we love the story and we want to take it on. After that, you sort of just forget about it unless they come back to you for editing, because and they will, because the editor then, the publishing house, will have her own views on, because on how the story will flow. So you will have to get into a bit of back and forth with the editor for revising your text. And for an illustrated storybook, that's where your role ends, because from that point on, the editor's job is therefore to then look for the illustrator, bring on the illustrator, go in for art direction, and bring out the book, etc., etc. So your role, and then your role will come back for finally again when the book is almost about to be ready, because that's where your inputs come in for promotion, and I mean, and finally, therefore, once the book is out, you're out there with your book. I mean, you have to own it with pride and take it to as many people as you can. So that's where your role restarts. So you giving it birth, then leaving it for a while. I mean, that's the gestation period where you have to. You can't forget about it, of course, but you have to patiently wait for it, and then it comes back to you.
Ma'am, how is the format a publisher accepted in?
Just the word. I mean, just put it in a normal text form, Word document. That's it. If it's a text for a picture book or an illustrated storybook, do not go in for illustrations. Don't look for an illustrator. Don't get your friend to illustrate it, etc., etc. All that's not going to work. So just put it in a normal text form, one by one, and that's it. Don't put too many art directions, art notes, that here I see the child in a red t-shirt yawning, etc. Don't, unless it's something very, very specific. I mean, that the editor cannot understand. Only that specific point you put as a I would say art note. Otherwise, don't make it too detailed, because that's something publishers don't like at all. I mean, it's the first sort of put off for the editor.